Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on the power of ESG data. My name is Russell Marsh. I work for EY in Singapore, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon. The program this afternoon has been organised by the SME Bank and what's called the JC3 Joint Committee on Climate Change, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. And the program is supported by the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, which is a UK government funded program delivered by EY and working across the region. The webinar today will run from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. We have a 10-minute break in between. Throughout the session, we'll be using polling questions, and we do ask you to engage in those and give your answers to those polling questions, and we'll have some feedback questions towards the end of the webinar. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions of the speakers. If you do have a question for any of the speakers, please use the Q&A function of this Zoom call. Quick click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and you can then ask your question. You can see on the screen now who our 5 speakers are for today. We have Arena, who is an EY partner in our climate change and sustainability service practice. We have Mike, who's an EY partner in our sustainable finance and a sustainable finance leader. Li Ming from Bank Negara, Malaysia. Helena Fung from FTSE Russell, and Miranda Carr from MSCI, and I'll introduce them all to you a bit later on as they start to speak. So just clarifying on the agenda for today. In a moment, we'll have some opening remarks, and then we will lead into the bulk and the meat of the presentations this afternoon through our speakers that I've just outlined. And then just to clarify what we're hoping you will learn, what the plan is for you to learn today, and leave the session having learned more about these particular topics, in particular, say, to enhance the understanding about the importance of ESG data, and why now, what are the drivers we're now seeing for ESG and market trends, the increased awareness on the global standards, indexes, and ESG data, and then how you might actually apply ESG criteria in decision making, say, such as credit decisioning and risk assessment. Say, we know from work we're doing around the region that data is one of the biggest questions we get asked. And so hopefully those of you on the call today will come away from the session today understanding a lot more about the data as it relates to ESG. I'm now going to pass over to our opening remarks, which are going to come from Dr. Arya, who's Group President and Chief Executive Officer of SME Bank.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good afternoon to all. As SME Bank is one of the members of Subcommittee 4 on Engagement and Capacity Building, I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the Joint Committee on Climate Change, or JC3, led by Bank Negara Malaysia and Security Commission Malaysia, for inviting me today to deliver these opening remarks. It gives me a great pleasure to be part of this significant endeavor. JC3 is a platform which was established in September 2019 to pursue collaborative action for building climate resilience within the Malaysian financial sector. For this year, the JC3 is geared to further strengthen our efforts by upskilling the capacity and capability of financial industry players in managing climate-related risks and supporting the scaling up of green finance. Ladies and gentlemen, the JAS series was curated in line with our mandate as Subcommittee 4 to build and strengthen the awareness of climate change and measures to ensure economic resilience. Building on the success of JAS Series 1 in January on incorporating ESG into risk management, JAS Series 2 is focusing on the governance and reporting, covering the topics of the power of the ESG data. Series 2 aims to expand on the importance of the ESG data and to equip participants with the necessary knowledge of the relevant standards and guidelines on ESG reporting. ESG has been gaining traction at a time when the climate crisis threatened and the social issues have been in the spotlight amid the pandemic. FI and investors are increasingly recognizing the importance of integrating ESG criteria in their decision-making and analysis. However, without the know-how to manage and make use of the data, this important effort will be a great loss. With this workshop, we aim to help participants gain an understanding of the importance of ESG data, including the drivers for ESG and market trends, increase awareness of global standards, indexes, and understanding of the application of ESG criteria in decision-making, which include credit scoring and risk assessment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed very fortunate to have with us today several prominent speakers from various fields of expertise who will be sharing their views and opinion on this important subject matter. Let us welcome Ms. Arina Kok and Mr. Mike Zahid-Meyer from Ernst & Young, Ms. Ong Lee Meng from Bank Negara Malaysia, Ms. Helena Fung from FTSE Russell, Ms. Marinda Carr of MSCI. Thank you to all of you for agreeing to be part of today's program. I am confident that all of us will be able to learn and expand our horizon on the importance of ESG data, and I hope with this new knowledge, we will be able to maximize the benefit of using ESG data in managing the ESG issues. The financial sector plays a critical role in tackling ESG issues by directing capital to businesses and projects that pave the way for the more sustainable futures. FI cannot do this without having access to the correct data to achieve their business goal, specifically ESG data. We at SME Bank, along with our fellow member of JC3, have recognized our active role in the sustainability space and are steadily implementing sustainability endeavor roadmaps, plans, and initiatives to contribute to this positive growing transition of the financial industry. At SME Bank, we have started embarking on a 3-year sustainability roadmap. The roadmap provides us with a clear approach and guidelines for the bank's future direction. Our 3 key principles in practicing sustainability are responsible banking, responsible business practices, and through creating social impact. Ladies and gentlemen, before I end my speech, once again, I would like to wish everyone a very fruitful workshop and discussion today. And do remember, without clear understanding of climate change, FI will be ill-equipped to cope with financial impacts. There is a quote by Winston Churchill that I would like to share before I conclude. I never worry about action, but only inaction. Let's take this journey of sustainability together. Thank you. Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Many thanks to Dr. Arya for those opening remarks. We're now going to move into the first session of this afternoon's webinar. This is called The Importance of Gathering Data and Non-Financial Disclosure and Standards and Guidelines on ESG Reporting. And this will be delivered by my colleague Arina, who's a partner in EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services practice. Over to you, Arina.
Thank you, Russell. So very good afternoon to everyone. I'm going into the session directly. So the first part is on the importance of data gathering and the non-financial disclosure. Hold on, yeah, I'm taking over the slide. Okay, can I have the control? Okay. Okay, thank you. So the first part is covering the importance of ESG data. When it comes to building resilience and transforming through ESG, I think a lot of businesses is trying to gather what is the value proposition. Why is it important to look at ESG in a strategic manner? Now, it's when we look at this, what does ESG entails? Under the E is environment ecosystem, S is on social inclusiveness, G is for governance. And when we look at these focus areas, it entails even broader subtopics or subcomponents, covers the climate change and carbon emissions, use of natural resources, waste management, clean energy and technologies, biodiversity as well. When we look at social, it does cover labor relations, forced labor, human rights, child labor, product safety, supply chain and diversity agenda. For governance, it looks at board independence, diversity, compensation, business ethics, cybersecurity, corruption, anti-money laundering. Now, these are the examples when we look at what ESG entails. But what's important is to understand from the various aspects which are most important and material to your organization and what are stakeholders essentially looking at. Now, having clarity on this material matters is just step one. Step two is actually performance. And step three is towards understanding how to better bring the performance to bring a long-term value creation. Now, what most of us will understand is some of these ESG material matters could threaten the business resilience as well as affect the way you can get access to capital, or some even halt the social license to operate. Now, all these are important to take into consideration into the long-term value creation because some of the implication could erode value almost immediately or overnight. And some could come in a slower pace, but in the longer run. So for example, those who are having forced labor issues, those could be a more immediate concerns as compared to, for example, like carbon taxonomy, carbon pricing, carbon tax. That would be an emerging risk that definitely will then come and be within the purview of most organizations. But what's most important is, after having understanding of ESG and performance, is to relate back to what are the long-term value that a business can create? Who are these value created for? So if we look on the diagram on the right, this is the framework that outlines long-term value creation. Who are you benefiting? What are being measured? How are you driving, such as systems, processes, risk management and compliance, measurement, reporting and assurance, and business strategy and transformation. And why is essentially to bring all the ESG to create value for organization, society, as well as for the planet. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay. So on this slide, we can see that when it comes to the strategic focus on ESG data, it can enable new business opportunities and help identify ESG risks, which in short reduces the risk of the cost to business. Now, in terms of the future enterprises, a lot of enterprises who already adopted and understand the why it's important are moving towards the how. And when they go towards the how, these are the 3 points. So business innovation are from green technologies and disruptions are the focus area. And they will also look at how can they pivot business model, reshape their business model, and look at the impact of their existing business model. So business innovation is one focus areas for those organizations who are moving to the how. Second is you will see that organizations which are ESG centric are placing people at the center of their decision making in the core leadership value driver and key management attribute. Now, in the most layman term, how do you evaluate if this is being driven? Is looking at the culture values of the organization and whether there are sufficient incentivization for ESG centric behavior. If remuneration are linked to ESG performance, that's one very strong criteria. and demonstration of commitment. The third part is increasing focus on the adoption of new global standards for measuring and reporting long-term value creation is driving ESG to become the core DNA of future enterprises. Now, I'll cover that in the following sections later when it comes to the convergence of ESG frameworks. But what you're seeing here is the landscape of doing business is already changing. So on the right-hand side, you will see that the E and the S, there are intersections or there are strategies that will help certain alignment. What it means is if there are steps taken to drive, for example, the second point, companies is taking new steps to take responsibility for social and environmental impacts of their operation. There are areas whereby CEO agree that certain solutionings will actually positively impact on environment and social concurrently. Now, one of the examples is digitalization. And those are the things whereby, for example, mobilizing digitalization can support, depending automation can reduce the usage of people to an extent, but it can also help to enable analytics and also capability building for the social aspects of talent. So there are many value propositions. The idea is future enterprises DNA are going to be defined as how they are driving the ESG-centric agenda and enabling multiple value creation cut across E, S, and G. So what I will do is also go into the next slide. Yeah. Now, when it comes to the key fundamentals of why ESG data is also gaining centric, we must not forget about the COP26, which outlined the 5 actions that businesses should take in 2022, the year of sustainability action. Now, recognize that there are still a lot of economic recovery and challenging landscape to navigate, but I think no organizations will be derailed in the long term from these 5 action steps. So the first part is business to contribute to keeping the 1.5 degrees alive, accelerating its efforts. Business should prepare for the implications of the changing market and regulatory landscape. And businesses now should expect and prepare for higher momentum of convergence of sustainability standards and consider the adaptation as an important part of their agenda. And climate change is everybody's business. Businesses need to now build resilience and consider what are the implications. Now, from a very layman perspective, or at least how this will affect businesses, the first one you will see is more and more leading organizations are setting standards and commitment to net zero or decarbonization. Now, whether like it or not, it will trickle down to the supply chain. Because in terms of setting these targets, it's really to look at how businesses are going to reshape their supply chain and also go towards a transition. So when we look at the guidance, it should mirror and follow how these are going to be driven. For example, if the agenda is on an annual basis to reduce emissions targets or emissions intensity, these are going to be a measurement and a mainstay reporting moving forward. And when we look at the implications are employees and stakeholders need to be foundationally competent. What it means is, as we move on to this year to moving forward, you will see there is a momentum of developing understanding of what emissions is, what are the reductions options, and almost all talent cut across, whether you're an engineer, whether you're in finance, whether you're in the operation side, these are going to be the common discussion points, which will also drive efficiency in operation. Now, the second part is we are really seeing that when it comes to businesses, they are starting to take stock of the wave of M&A activity to divest high carbon assets and acquire green technologies such as carbon capture, hydrogen, looking at EVs infrastructure, as well as renewable energy. So definitely the trend and momentum will continue. And it's important to understand now how the supply chain will exert positive influence. So for example, there are a lot of organizations that will start to pivot their business and services, looking at things that are positive in terms of footprint. You will see car automakers are looking at replacing their materials to biodegradable and also looking to more sustainable supply sourcing. And when we look at looking at the convergence of standards, I think it's important, and I will cover that later in more detail, which is the International Sustainability Standard Boards, the ISSB, set up by the IFRS Foundation, that will signal that all businesses must equip and report high quality sustainability information. Now, in short, everyone who's familiar with IFRS, the short understanding is it will now start to look at sustainability impact to financial statements, because it needs to now consider sustainability risks and opportunities and how it affects enterprise value. So in the longer run, you will see a lot of this risk where it is more certain, it will start to be considered and priced in when it comes to your financial statements. And it's important to understand data veracity to be key to lead on peer-to-peer comparison. So to a certain extent, your various stakeholders, your loans providers, capital providers, your insurers, as well as the creditors, all are starting to look at sustainability disclosures in a more strategic manner. So it's important to maintain a competitive advantage in how you articulate your sustainability reporting. And when it comes to business resilience, this is also important because this is also looking at while the world are going to pivot investments to adapt to the effects of climate change, there are also areas whereby it cannot come at the expense of mitigation. So what it means is you don't wait until flood happens, but you need to look at what are causing the weather changes pattern, which is emissions. So mitigation is very much looking at also what are the avenues to ensure that collectively we are ensuring that temperatures doesn't continue to rise. And one of the direct way is to ensure that businesses now need to move towards understanding emissions, limiting it, and policymakers and governments are going to come up with more stringent taxonomy when it comes to emissions, including eventually to cover methane as well. So this is part of, for example, Malaysia, the methane pledge, during the COP26 that has happened. So the last part is really when it comes to having this dialogue on climate change, it is critical because activists will be creating more energy and momentum and highlighting the issues that businesses may not understand at this point, but activists must also understand that businesses cannot transform their supply chain overnight. So there needs to be a coordinated transformation that takes into the holistic view, building on what has been considered alliances, co-creation of solutions, as well as understanding economics. When the economics falls into place, there will be natural pivoting of businesses to green solutions. For example, if you look at about 10 years ago, when renewable energies like solar power, it is still at a very high price. But given the constant innovation and the reduction of the price of renewable energy, at one point of time in certain jurisdiction, it would likely be cheaper to operate renewable energy plant as compared to conventional power plants that runs on the fossil fuels. So this has already happened in various jurisdictions, and we will see that trend continue as we go ahead. So when we look at what regulators are doing in this space of ESG, and this is very important because that is where the push from regulator is. But one thing to note is also because there is a need to drive coordinated advancement. We don't want to be in an ecosystem or assist financial systems or an economic whereby we are in the lagging position. So what happens is, if we look at what regulators have been pushing, is bringing the readiness and also looking at where the expectations are continue to rise for businesses that wants to operate internationally. Now, for example, if we look at here, Malaysia has already adopted back in 2015 the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, And Bursa Malaysia has started since 2015 to require all listed issuers to disclose sustainability statements annually by 2018. Now, at this point, we were one of the leading jurisdiction or country in the region to have this made mandatory. Subsequent to that, you will see there are additional advancements. For example, Bank Negara launched the value-based intermediation strategy paper and guidance documents. We have also seen the Malaysia Anti-Corruption Act amended to introduce corporate liability for corruption offences. Subsequently, we have also seen Securities Commission and Bank Negara form the Joint Committee on Climate Change, JC3, to actually drive further capability building on sustainable finance and climate risk management. So we are also seeing the launch of by SC, Sustainable and Responsible Investments, and the roadmap. To a certain extent, Bank Negara has also issued the VBI, Financing and Investment Impact Assessment, VBIF, and we have also seen Bank Negara issued the sectorial guides for energy efficiency, renewable energy, and palm oil, and subsequently additional 3 more as well in this year: oil and gas, construction and infrastructure, and manufacturing. So all these guidance are actually stepped up advancement to support companies or listed companies to understand and take their ESG up a few notches, recognizing there are nuanced issues in different sectors, but there is a need to mature ESG practices and advancement. So if we look at this year alone, Bursa Malaysia have also revised the main market listing to have at least 1 female director by 1st September. And if you're above 2 billion market cap, and by 1st June 2023, if your market cap is below 2 billion. Now that's to drive diversity and also to drive knowledge capability as well. And if we look at Bank Negara Malaysia, they have also announced the financial sector blueprint 2022 to 2026, looking to position financial system to facilitate a transition to a greener economy, because we know that businesses can't pivot if the finance side does not rally the movement to this area. So one thing I wanted to note is also, if you look at last year, it's not just the financial system is moving. Even from the government side, SEDA has released their National Low Carbon Cities Master Plan, and there has been push in terms of where the focus areas are to bring 120 cities to carbon neutral, and starting with the first 30 cities. So definitely there are avenues, and you see CASA that will develop a domestic emissions trading schemes as well. So if we look at understanding where the regulators are driving, the momentum is not going to go down, because a lot of roadmaps, guidelines, and blueprints have been put in place, and the journey is ongoing at this point. So why is it important to also understand the context of ESG index? Because quite a number of corporates not only need to focus on regulations, they also have to understand the index that they are actually in as well. So if we look at the evolution of global and local ESG index from back to 1990, when MSCI first had the ESG index, down to 2021, Securities Commission have also have the FTSE for Good Bursa Malaysia Sharia Index, as well as SC has then updated the Malaysia Code of Corporate Governance to outline board's responsibility on sustainability. Now, according to the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, sustainable investment assets grew 34% from January 2016 to January 2018. Now, this demonstrates the interest and the need and the flow of the funding to this avenue. On the UN SDG, you also see that for a number of organizations, the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment has grown to represent and support over 3,000 financial institutions that manage in excess of $100 trillion. Now, this UNPRI has been adopted by Khazanah, the PNB, as well as EPF. So all these will start to move towards responsible investment. Local government funds, as you can see, have become signatories of UNPRI. And when it comes to the benefits, it is very clear if you look at this diagram, because most organizations will say that, now, do I really get value if I enhance my ESG performance? So in a recent study by MSCI, it shows 5 conclusions about the relationship between ESG and financial performance. It is going to improve financial performance because ESG is becoming more marked over the longer time horizons. ESG investing appears now to provide downside protection, especially during a social or economic crisis, and sustainability initiatives at corporations appear to drive better financial performance due to mediating factors such as improved risk management and more innovation. Now, what you can see is pre-COVID and post-COVID, for those organizations who already have good processes on managing health and safety, they fare better than as they handle COVID, as compared to companies who have not had the health and safety measurements in place. So this is just one example. The other part is studies are also indicating that managing for a low carbon future will improve financial performance. For example, if organizations are investing into reducing their own emissions or getting renewable energy, when the carbon taxonomy comes in, they are better positioned and have more resilience when it comes to cost management, because emissions will eventually be a cost. We've already seen in Singapore carbon tax being implemented since 2019, and the other markets like Singapore has already started. Indonesia have announced carbon tax despite the delay. 1st April is when they initially targeted to also launch carbon tax in Indonesia. So what we are looking is ESG disclosure on its own does not drive financial performance, but it will have the interrelation and impact to the financial performance. So on the right-hand side is the ESG ratings and the market performance correlation. And this is where you can take away to see that it provides the gross return comparing between the MSCI Europe ESG leaders versus the MSCI Europe market. Now, when we also look at for the Malaysia consideration, the indices that outperform their respective, what we've seen is they outperform their respective local capital markets, indicating that ESG investment focus in the ASEAN markets. So you can see that the FTSE for Good have outperformed by 3.7%. And in Singapore, the ESG leaders outperformed by 1%. And ESG transparency outperformed by 4%. So in terms of, how do we then look at how does this transpire to opportunities? How do you capture and capitalize on ESG data to unlock opportunities and stay ahead of the curve? For environment, is really understanding what are the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, NOx, SOx emissions, particulate emissions per operating hour. Now, why is all these important? Is because it will help eventually to ensure that there are better reputation, financing, understanding how these emissions will result in new cost or emerging cost that is to come in when the taxonomy comes, and to build resilience to respond to also physical and transition risks, such as designing new production processes. From a social aspects, it's also to look at while these are the measurements and metrics that typically organizations measure, for example, diversity, gender, ethnicity, ratio of foreign to local hire of low-skilled workers, employment arrangement, local and foreign. A number of the sectors who have been plagued by all these issues definitely understands that the opportunities are really to understand and assess, what are the data sets that is important to drive strategy. So for those that is looking to advance on social, it is to improve reputation among stakeholders, improve financial performance, and outperform peers through gender diversity. So what you're looking at organizations, for example, in the agriculture sector or the palm oil sector has been looking at handling this, where the first area is really to ensure that the policies and processes brings equal opportunity so that they can retain the workforce. But where the advanced areas of those who are looking at this, they are already looking at paying higher than the minimum wage, providing better accommodation, ensuring that there are education for those who have family members. So there is a gradual advancement on strategy. On governance, you will see that the composition, competencies, understanding the ESG is going to be critical, where in our conversation with over 30 to 50 board members in the past 12 months, they've outlined that there is a need for all board members to also, on a very periodic basis, upgrade and enhance their understanding on ESG, not just performance, but how to embed this in business corporate strategy as well. So having the access to data is very important, because that will also help reputation among the stakeholders, as well as improving the top level decision making, having the breadth of perspective. Now, understanding this, we will go into the next part, which is identifying the information gap, because for organizations that already understand where the key focus areas are, which is ESG data, they are already on the trajectory of addressing and recognizing where the gaps are when it comes to ESG. So before we start, maybe let's take a quick polling to break the ice. And maybe Joel, can we have the polling up? Yep. So click on the poll. What do you think is the biggest challenge in relation to ESG data? Is it insufficient data, too many data providers, no internal capability to analyze ESG data, or not sure which data to use? So if you can, do click on the poll and click submit. We will also be very keen to share what are the responses from today's participants. We had over 1,000 participants who have signed up, and that is where we see a very enlarged interest on this topic as well. Okay, we'll give half a minute more for everyone. So some of you will think that, yeah, it is very important, but to some extent, there's so much of data to be collected. Who should own the data? In some of the conversations that we are having, who owning the data and who uses the data could be very different. But the common consensus is, first, you need to have the data. And what we are also working on with a lot of corporates is how to ensure the data have accuracy, good quality, and the timeliness of having this data to inform strategy. Okay, I think we have the polling. Now you can see majority, 39% talks about insufficient data. 32% next is no internal capability to analyze ESG data, followed by not sure which data to use. Last 5% is too many data providers. Okay, thanks for the feedback. We'll go on to next. Now, just to give everyone a landscape of why it's important when it comes to data in the context of ESG, there are multiple ESG use cases. When I say use case, means what are the importance of how ESG are being taken when it comes to data, and where it presents the biggest challenges around understanding and measuring ESG data. So in terms of the data sources, typically you will see there are traditional ESG rating providers, investment research houses, and emerging AI-driven quant methodologies. Now, what all these have is actually to provide information on the ESG data. But when it comes to internal methodology and validation is the ESG engine. Now, what the ESG engine do is also to look at the compliance, what are the sustainable finance regulations, reporting, what are the product whether at the product level or corporate levels. For example, if you issue ESG or sustainability linked bonds or frameworks, what are the reporting requirements? Risk management, portfolio level and group level. Now we can see quite a number of risk management are starting to enhance their enterprise risk management to cover the emerging ESG risk. When you talk about new products and services, this is where, for example, you will see, for example, deployment of smart meter by Tenaga. That is also to ensure that businesses now also have clarity on the energy consumption and also ability to look at what are the new products and services that the market really needs. And when it comes to investment processes, is asset allocation, security valuation. So all these ESG, all these will actually drive the advancement of the ESG data. And when it comes to ESG information, these are the 5 challenges to the usefulness and effectiveness of ESG reporting. The first one is we look at it from the highest first is there is lack of information of how company creates long-term value. There is lack of focus on material issues that really matter. So what it's saying is a lot of organizations are still reporting things that does not matter as compared to the most critical ESG areas. And the next one is there is still a disconnect between ESG reporting and mainstream financial information, the lack of real-time information, and the lack of forward-looking disclosures. So if we look at the context is really to understand data accessibilities. When we look at the what is the focus, our EY taught leadership on why data remains the biggest ESG investing challenges. The lack of it is not able to actually have a forward-looking ESG data and valuing the reporting to ensure that financial institutions can model future earnings, future valuations. So without, for example, without clarity of how market is going to price in emissions, because some markets or jurisdictions have not have carbon taxonomy yet. But imagine carbon tax or emission trading schemes are being deployed, let's say in the next 2 years or 5 years. Overnight, there will be pricing in an evaluation on future earnings as well. So the data accessibility are where it has not come to a point where organizations have sufficient data or capability to model that future earnings impact. The other part is also assessing company that is on a path to transition, which is more important than the current environmental and social impact. So the trade-offs are very critical. Do you invest in renewable energy or do you invest in efficiencies? Those are the things that needs to be defined and provided context to your investors. In terms of data suitability, is really also looking at the ESG scores, risk, creating further distance between an investor's understanding of a company and its real world impact. So to a certain extent, it's not just looking at ESG scoring, but also to understand how this scoring actually result in the company being able to create value for stakeholders. So when we look at the next part is when you have better quality ESG data, you will see that companies will then be able to move ahead and advance to fuller potential. Now, this provides a high-level maturity mind map on how ESG is being managed. So on the basic foundational level, companies will then buy single sets data from single provider, from perhaps few different third-party data providers to meet basic regulatory expectations. So for example, if an organization wants to know how well a company is or how risky, they can actually get the first sets of data sets. The more intermediate is where across the middle spectrum, companies are using several different third-party sources to meet a range of data needs. So companies will then gain a better understanding, and they will look at multiple data sets to start integrating ESG considerations across business functions. Now, for example, if an investor or asset manager wants to invest in, for example, companies that are in a specific sector, for example, energy sector, they may start to look at the energy efficiency data sets from various data providers. If the companies or the intended investee does not report energy intensity data sets. Now, for the more advanced level, more progressive firms are starting to engage in risk management, seeking out commercial opportunities, while market leaders in this space are driving innovation, spearheading collaborative initiatives, and the creation of alternative reporting metrics, and the harmonization of ESG data taxonomies. So for those who are already advanced, they are using market modeling capability to start to look at where are the opportunities for market, what are the pricing or tipping points, for example, EV infrastructure or EV opportunities. And the next part is on ideal. Now, this is where the ultimate target state for all companies is to have integrated ESG data model that uses a consistent source of ESG data for all use case, whether is it to drive efficiency, where you put in a certain carbon pricing internally to ensure your business operations down to supply chain starts to be more efficient, or you are using, for example, data sets like ESG or carbon pricing to also look at how do you want to price in potential future prices of carbon taxonomy in your feasibility study or when you want to invest in various projects. So historically, you may not have priced in some of these ESG aspects when you do your due diligence for deals, but this is becoming quite a mainstay for organizations who are already at an advanced level, because they will start to also price in the risk moving forward. Now, investors and corporates are starting to align and mandate this ESG performance transparency for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Definitely, you will see the yellow ones represent the user's perspective, which is the investor, whereas the gray ones are from the issuer perspective, the finance leaders. So it is percentages of respondents who think that the actions by policymakers would be helpful is to mandate reporting ESG performance measures against a set of globally consistent standards, mandating independent assurance around ESG performance measures. In our region, I would say that aside from Singapore, who has mandated emissions to be audited and submitted for facility that has higher emissions on carbon emissions because there's carbon tax, Thailand as a market has also started to push for assurance on ESG data over the past 1 year as well. So we are seeing regulators requiring companies to also disclose major ESG risk and uncertainties to continue the viability in the near, mid, or long term. So when you look at financial institutions, they are facing challenges in understanding ESG data and how third-party providers can meet their needs. Now, with Bank Negara directive on the climate change and principles-based taxonomy, as well as the exposure draft on climate risk management, there are a number of advancement or at least efforts that are being put in this place. But when you talk about the challenges is models, when it comes to different models, some could apply simplified assumptions, therefore it reduces the relevance of results, means too simplified assumptions, you won't be able to come up with the outcome and be more strategic on the results of what you're modeling. But there's no silver bullet that covers all ESG data needs. Off-the-shelf models may not accurately capture tail risk events and uncoordinated, delayed policy action. So for example, in the market now, if any organizations who understands, they will start to tag in their financial operating model how flood risk affects their systems, as well as counterparty risk or their credit risk assessment. So these are things whereby you need to then go back and understand how your processes have started to embed this. And if we look on the right-hand side, most data or modeling providers are not an out-of-the-box solution. Not all providers will cover the full spectrum of risk, and the aggregation of data is not always transparent. So for example, if you look at the rating variance challenges between the Just Capital, they rate Tesla in the bottom 10% due to weighting on workers' rights. For MSCI, they have rated A grade due to the weighting on companies' environmental impact. So even for Tesla alone, there are variances in the rating assessment. So when it comes to the need is to ensure that there are stronger connection between financials and ESG data. If you're able to connect these two, which is the future of reporting and where stakeholders are looking for, it's no longer just reporting ESG data, but understanding what are the linkages to financials. And you will see that for convergence, ESG data does not have the same degree of consistency, robustness, and comparability at international level as compared to financial data. While financial data, there has been a long historical trend to streamline the approach, the methodology, the calculation. What we have seen here is for ESG, it is growing, but we as a global of professionals, the data, the standard setters have recognized that since financials can be advanced, ESG, or we call it the non-financials, can also be advanced using the same thought process, faster, better, and smarter. So in terms of the adoption, market forces is not able to deliver the potential of ESG to bring out the integration into strategy and target setting. So regulators and government can bring much needed stability to certain ESG reporting. So as I mentioned, different jurisdiction, for example, Singapore is ramping very much on emissions. Some other jurisdiction will also provide other aspects. 84% of investors do believe that most companies are unprepared to comply with potential ESG disclosure regulations. Now, this is important to note because this is part of our EY 6 Global Institutional Survey when it comes to the readiness to ESG disclosure regulations. Now, when it comes to assurance, it's important to note that it is going to be a core focus. As I mentioned, Thailand has already moved ahead. Trust in ESG needs to be protected by the same approach used to prevent financial misreporting. At this point, a lot of organizations who put out their annual report, their sustainability report is still unaudited. Only some certain handful of leading players have started with assurance on their sustainability material matters. So in terms of innovation, financial and non-financial information must be connected to shape strategy and allow interested parties to assess the sustainability in the context of both financial performance and consequences. What we see here is historically, emissions is not looked at in that importance, but the moment there are taxonomies around emissions, everyone will then rush to look at the importance of emissions and the implications to cost pricing and valuation of assets. So the new methodologies needs to be developed to fully incorporate sustainability into strategy, capital allocation, operations to enhance ESG with greater financial relevance. So we'll go on to the second part, which is on regulations and standards on ESG and sustainability reporting. The first part we're going to cover is what are the overview of sustainability reporting regulations and standards. So the first part, we'll do a quick polling. Does your organization publish ESG disclosures or sustainability report? Now, I do see participants in the chat providing thanks for those who have kept it very interactive. I see participants saying this is exactly the pain point for reporting companies. There is no standardized data formula, while third-party data provider is charging fee excessively. We are also seeing quite a number of areas when it comes to how do we then, as an ecosystem, drive better alignment and efficiency in data. Okay, so maybe let's look at the poll, whether it's a yes or no. This is a very straightforward question. So if we can have the poll from everyone. Now, we have a participant that asked, what are the existing benchmark or standards for organization as reference point to compare their data collected for comparison and reporting, since ESG itself is so varied and different from industries to industries and even companies amongst the same industry. Now, I'm going to cover it in this segment. So let me go through the frameworks and standards, and then everyone can have some appreciation on what are the typical comparatives. So 55%, a majority of those who have voted, does publish ESG reporting. And that's where we are seeing that for Malaysia landscape, predominantly most reporters over 7 years since Bursa announced have already been familiar or have been publishing ESG disclosures. A majority, 25%, said that no, and 20% said not sure. So for those not sure, I encourage you to maybe start Googling your organization and see if you do report. So in future, we will have a yes or no answer only. So the next part is for ESG reporting landscape, it is really evolving. There are multiple frameworks, as I mentioned. So given the growing complexities, we have categorized here. So when it comes to the rating agencies, we have Standards & Poor's, Dow Jones Indices, FTSE4Good, ISS, MSCI, Refinitiv, Sustainalytics, and Fitch Ratings. Now, they use different and often abstruse methods to assess ESG performance. With public and non-public data, it can be difficult to ascertain the true ESG performance because they have their own rulers and data sets. So when it comes to data providers, they usually summarize and occasionally score ESG performance, and ESG performance can differ based on the types of indicators assessed. So if we see here, these are the various reporting frameworks: GRI, SASB, TCFD, CDP, and Integrated Reporting Framework. Now we'll talk about convergence of these frameworks next, but you will see that aside from ratings frameworks, there are also media reports, publications, court cases that companies need to also have within your purview. Data providers would be those we've outlined here, Bloomberg, Vestiv, and all. Now, what we have seen is, given the multiple frameworks and the pain points of trying to adopt many sustainability frameworks, the International Sustainability Standard Boards intends to deliver a global baseline of sustainability-related disclosure standards. Now, why this is important? Because this convergence will ensure that everyone comes to the same set of guidelines and ruler, and there is also an alignment of how ESG are being evaluated. Ultimately, everyone wants to see the same set of ruler as well as the approach or methodology to report on sustainability. So with the estimated of 600 ESG reporting standard, it is to bring all these together to drive rigor, assurance, and comparability. Now, what happened is ISSB have already issued the prototype, 2 prototypes, climate-related disclosure prototype. This is building on TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations, and to also look at how climate-related risks and opportunities are being considered and the impact to their financial statements. Whereas the general requirement prototype is to provide guidance on disclosing other ESG matters that will affect enterprise value, consolidating key aspects from the existing standard setters. So if the organization have labor issues, forced labor, human rights, it will also be covered under the general requirements prototype if those are areas that will affect enterprise value. So if we go on to the next slide, in view of the changing ecosystem, Malaysia regulators are increasing their attention on ESG reporting. So what we are seeing is on top of the requirements by Bursa, Bank Negara, and SC, these are the key bullets that all organizations are starting to look at. So I won't go through all this in detail because you can read later from the various frameworks, such as the VBIAF impact assessment framework that Bank Negara issued, as well as the MCCG. But what I wanted to outline here is what's important by the Malaysia Code of Corporate Governance is these 4 bullet points. There is a need to have a designated person in management, whether it's a chief executive officer or chief sustainability officer or chief sustainability officer or chief strategy officer. Someone must be dedicated to drive focus on managing sustainability. Board is now having a clear responsibility on sustainability targets, priorities, and strategies with management. So based on Bursa's review on sustainability, is also saying that board needs to approve materiality matrix. And on the other part is to review the performance in addressing companies' material risks and opportunities. Board need to stay abreast to understand the issues. So trainings all needs to now consider. When we talk about the options of frameworks, here we have laid down the plethora of ESG frameworks or the ABC soups of sustainability frameworks. I won't go through in detail, but what you need to understand is different framework cater for different audience. Some are very much investors focused, some are value chain and broader focus such as CDP. Some are very much catered to government agencies and policymakers like UN SDGs. So these are the key things that you can consider when you decide which frameworks are best suited. But most leading organizations will start to adopt not just on sustainability like GRI or SASB, they will start to also adopt UN SDGs on target setting. So there is a difference of how this framework support not just reporting, but setting targets as well. So if we look at what are the scope in order to choose, how do we then choose the right reporting standards for company? This gives somehow key considerations. If you are looking at the GRI, they have a broader stakeholders, and the scope of reporting is very much for broader catering, not just climate or environment. It covers the SDGs or ESGs, the broader spectrum of sustainability. Whereas the one in yellow are very much for narrow. Some are very much focused on investors and also focused on climate. So CDSV as well as TCFD is very much on climate. So what's important is to decide whether the focus is only on environment aspects or you are going beyond environment when you look at the frameworks that you decide to adopt. Now, 6 ways for companies to enhance ESG reporting is to focus on what's material in connection to strategy. So typically how we look at effectiveness of sustainability management is how much is connected to your business plan, your corporate strategy. Second is the alignment of disclosures to external frameworks. Are you in a way adopting how the global international are going towards managing these material matters? Disclose matrix performance and goals. Target setting is very critical. Consider the integration of ESG alongside traditional financial metrics. enhance data credibility through assurance, and making sure company disclosures are picked up by third-party data aggregators. So when it comes to also choosing the right sustainability ratings, is also to consider the size of audience and what you're reporting. You will see here whether you want to decide on science-based targets, or you are looking at EcoVadis for supply ratings, or climate bonds initiatives when it comes to the more narrow scope. So asset managers now do use a range of ESG data provider. With this outlines a context of which are the more commonly used based on the EY's analysis. So you will see that MSCI, ISS, ESG, and Sustainalytics are the top 3 ones that are being used as compared to a long list of other data providers. And when it comes to sustainability reporting, it can lead to superior corporate performance. So I've already covered and mentioned what are the objectives of ESG rating, but it's important to ensure that companies would be perceived to be falling behind if their ESG rating are likely to see, and investors, once their ESG rating drop, that's where their investors are also shrinking over time. So last part that I have here is case studies, examples of leading practices. Now that we've covered what are the frameworks, how to select the frameworks, and what are the choices and impacts from the ESG rating. So when it comes to the case study, just a few slides as key takeaway of what the leading practices are that we see in today's landscape. Now this will also change over time as organizations get more mature. But if we look at, like, for example, Bursa Malaysia Berhad, Sustainalytics rating is 13.1, low and strong definition. But what I wanted to outline here is for those advancing on sustainability governance, it's important to show how this is governed, starting with the board, C-suites, all the way down to the business unit, tasked with execution of the sustainability strategy. Now, it's also important in terms of how they report balance, disclosing their higher emissions and electricity consumption. So it's to ensure that reporting is not just on good stories, but a balanced reporting. The next part is we will also see that when it comes to balanced reporting, it shows the methodology of how you're reporting consistently. So what Bursa Malaysia has done is to provide a transparent calculation scope and approach on their matrix impacting climate, on risks and opportunities. The next part is we are seeing also another example is CIMB Group, whereby when it comes to their materiality, what's their importance and their focus, they detail out both internal and external stakeholders were engaged as part of their materiality assessment. They have classified what's highly material and important, and they allow reader to understand their priorities of each matter and the impact to the organization's sustainability approach. So you will see here is on top of that, CIMB has also provided the success measures, the baseline performance, and their forward-looking goals and commitments in a simplified table, allowing readers to understand how they identify progress towards their 2025 targets. For example, you can see that there is a time-bound measurable target to include in the baseline. Now, I've come to the end of my sharing session. I hope that has been helpful. Maybe I'll pass the floor back to Russell.
Thanks, Arena. Very comprehensive and detailed presentation. Many thanks for that. We are running a little bit behind time. So the suggestion now is that we don't do any live Q&A with Arena now. There's lots of questions on the Q&A box on the Zoom, and we'll ask Arena over the next hour or so of this webinar to answer some of those online, and then we might come back to some of them and get her to answer some of those questions verbally at the end if we have time. So we will now take a short break, but we won't go for 10 minutes. We'll go for a short break, and if people can come back at about 4:15, so we'll start again at 4:15 when we will get an update on the work of the JC3 SC5. So Thanks all for your attention so far. I've hoped you found it useful, and say please do come back in about 5 minutes so we can restart the session. Hi, everybody. As we said, we would get underway at 4:15, which is in about a minute by my watch. So hope everyone's getting ready to start again. And just to answer what is always the most common question that we get on these events, it's coming up several times, is around about getting access to the materials from today's event. Yes. The materials that we're showing today, the slides, will be circulated to participants following this event. So don't worry if you have missed anything, or you just want to be able to go through the slides at your own pace. You will get sent them after the event. But as it is now 4:15 and we still have a lot of really good content to get through today, I'm going to move on to the next session. If we could have the next slide, please. Great. So we're now going to hear from the JC3SC5, which is Subcommittee 5 of the Joint Committee on Climate Change. And we're going to hear from Ling Ming, who's a director in the Data and Statistics Management Department at Bank Negara in Malaysia, but she also heads up the Secretariat for the Subcommittee 5 of the JC3, and I'll hand over to her to explain a bit more about the work of the JC3 SC5. Li Ming, over to you.
Thanks, Russell, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm very pleased and honored today to be able to be invited to be part of this workshop to share some of the work that the Subcommittee 5 on Bridging Data Gaps have undertaken, and in terms of some of the findings that we have encountered, and also, of course, the way forward in terms of what are the plans that's in place for us to address the data gaps. So moving on to the first slide. So this is in terms of introduction of the JC3 Subcommittee 5. So this subcommittee is the newest subcommittee within the JC3 that was established last July. And basically, we are mandated to identify what are the crucial data that is needed by the financial sector to manage the climate and environment related risks, and also what are the data sources that's available, and also, of course, to identify what are the access constraints, issues, and data gaps that's been encountered. And lastly is to make recommendations on potential solutions to address these data gaps. In terms of membership, this subcommittee is chaired by our Assistant Governor, Mr. Fraziali Ismail. And right now, it consists of 42 members from 28 institutions, cut across banking institutions, ministries, government agencies, asset managers, insurers, and also regulators. And of course, as mentioned by Russell just now, my department, the Data Management and Statistics Department, is the secretariat to this committee. Moving to the next slide. So this is the key deliverables that we have set for this year, and also, of course, going beyond this year as well, 2023 and beyond. In terms of the key outcome that we are hoping to achieve this year is that right now we have ascertained the data availability and identified the gaps. And going forward, we are looking to establish a data catalog as a source of reference for the financial sector. And not only that, it will also serve as a call for action, and also in terms of raising awareness, what are some of the data issues that we are encountering. And also in terms of getting the stakeholders together in terms of addressing some of the data gaps. And lastly is we are also intending to produce a recommendation and explore initiatives to bridge the data gaps of the top 8 data items. And this will include solutions to make this data to be more available, accessible, and comparable. And also, of course, in the meantime, while some of this data is not available, what are the methodology or proxies that's out there to fill the missing data and to translate this data into financial usable form. Going forward, 2023 and beyond, we will then expand this to cover the remaining data items that's being profiled in the data catalog. And also, of course, in terms of looking to also partner with public and private entities to maintain the data catalog, as basically it's actually a living document because it will reflect the data needs at that point of time. And also, of course, as data become more available, this would need to be updated as well. And lastly is, of course, the advocacy work that we are also undertaking with the public and private entities to make the data to be more available, accessible, and comparable. Moving on to the next slide. This is in terms of the broad action plan with timeline. So we have started with phase 1, where we have established the use cases and also the metrics. This is also in line with what the Network for Greening Financial System and GFS have also undertaken. So the use cases that we have agreed on are actually for example, in terms of disclosure, exposure quantification, and also investment and lending decisions. And once this is set, then we moved on to the phase 2, which is then we identify what are the data that is needed for these use cases. And basically what we did is we went through in terms of the number of use cases for each of the data items, and those with more use cases will of course be prioritized. And that's how we derive the top 8 data items that I will elaborate more later. Currently, we're in phase 3, which is in terms of establishing the data availability and also the gaps. So right now, we are actually engaging the data providers, including government agencies, for example, CATSA, the Meteorology Department, to confirm on data availability and gaps. And moving on to the next phase in the second half of 2022, we are looking to publish the data catalog by end of the year. And this will be accessed, this can be accessed by the financial sector. And going forward is to present recommendations in terms of how we can address some of the gaps that have been encountered. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so this shows the data catalog that is in progress. So we have already actually completed the first draft of the data catalog. And now we're in a consultation phase with other JC3 subcommittees to gauge the usefulness and comprehensiveness of this data catalog. So I would also like to take this opportunity to encourage the JC3 subcommittee members, if you are part of this, part of the audience, to respond to our survey, which will be very helpful to ensure that what's been published at the end of the year would serve your data needs. So currently, we are in the midst of validating the content of the data catalog, and we'll be engaging external experts to do so. And of course, as I said earlier, in terms of engaging the data providers as well to confirm on data availability and benchmarking with other work as well, that is also helpful. In this case, for example, the NGFS has actually established a repository of data as well, similar to our initiative. And we are looking to publish this in PDF and Excel format by end of the year. And next year, of course, we are looking into digitalizing it and to make it more user-friendly for the audience. Next, this is in terms of the overview of our data catalog, what it looks like. So I'd like to take this opportunity to emphasize that our data catalog is in terms of outlining what are the data sources that's out there. It's actually not a centralized data warehouse, as sometimes it's misunderstood to have data itself. So currently, actually, it will only have the data sources in terms of the data that's needed by the financial sector. So it will have information in terms of for example, the dimension, the time horizon, who are the data providers, what are the links if it's available, and of course, what are the use cases that it serves. Moving to the next slide. In the course of us coming up with this data catalog, we have actually found certain interesting facts, and also in terms of also looking at in terms of what are those areas where the data availability is lacking. So overall, we found that for the top 8 data groups, 77% of this data are available. But having said that, only 15% is readily available. So the issue with the current available data sources is that most of it actually lack granularity. And this is mainly in the area of physical risk and also energy. So as an example, we would need fuel consumption data by sector, but the source, which is the Malaysian Energy Info Hub by the Energy Commission, currently publishes the crude oil, petroleum, and coal consumption at aggregate level. So it's not available at the sector level. So meanwhile, 8% are actually not readily available, as it requires effort for users to gather this data from individual sources, such as annual reports, or it's collected but not disclosed. Lastly, 15% are not available. And as I said earlier, these are mainly in energy and physical risks. For example, the severity of storm data, which would require further engagement with the relevant ministries. So we'll be reaching out to ministries such as KETSA, Meteorology Department, and also NAHRIM this quarter for us to understand whether or not the data is available, and if so, how can we make it more available going forward. Moving on to the next slide. These are the top 8 data items that I have mentioned earlier. So what we have done is that as I said, we have prioritized this together with the JC3. And basically what came up top is actually the greenhouse gas emission, which serve the most use cases, followed by the green sustainable lending financing data, energy data, and also exposure to physical risks. Number 5 is in terms of asset value at risk. 6 is in terms of ESG score and rating, and then followed by water consumption. And lastly is in terms of biodiversity and deforestation indicators. Okay, moving on to the next slide. These are some of the key data gaps for the top 8 data groups. So most of it is actually in terms of the issue is also, besides lacking granularity, as I mentioned earlier. So for example, the flood and extreme weather data lacks location granularity. So for example, rainfall data is only available up to the weather station level. So for example, in Malaysia, we have 504 weather stations, but going forward, we would need more granular data. Whereas there are also some data that is being collected, but is currently proprietary in nature. So for example, mainly in terms of financing, and also in terms of renewable energy data, which requires subscription, asset value at risk as well, and also in terms of water consumption and waste management are currently not publicly available. And that aside, the even more acute data gap is in terms of lack of forward-looking data. In terms of GHG emission scope 1 and 2, forward projections are limited. And also in terms of, for example, electricity consumption as well, that is currently just published twice a year. And also in terms of granularity, it is limited to consumer level and not aggregated level. And last but not least, in terms of data that is not available here, is in terms of GHG emission scope 3, which is still lacking. And also in terms of the energy data by currency dimension that's needed. So currently it's published in its current kilowatt per hour units. And also lastly, in terms of carbon credit price data, this is currently not available, but as most of you will have known, the government has announced under the 12th Malaysian Plan that they are actually preparing to introduce carbon pricing instruments, such as the domestic emission trading system and carbon tax. So with such policy instruments, this will actually send a signal to private firms and banking sectors to make an appropriate decision for low carbon investment and commercial operations. And the data gap for this carbon credit data will be addressed over time. Moving on to the next slide. So these are some of the initiatives that currently we are exploring, the Subcommittee 5, to address the data gaps that I have elaborated earlier. So the first initiative relates to green financing and investment data. If you recall, the first gap that I mentioned earlier is in terms of limited availability of data at the bond issuance or loan origination state. So hence, we are looking at ways how to improve the identification of these green bonds or sukuk at issuance level at the relevant platforms such as FAST for the ease of identification by investors. Holistically, we are also currently assessing the data which is required to be enriched in the relevant systems. So for example, one of the system is SICRIS. So we are looking at adding geolocation data of underlying physical assets for physical risk assessment at the loan origination stage. Secondly is in terms of the extreme weather risk model, we are looking to address the issue about the missing granular data and also the forward-looking data by using by leveraging on spatial analysis and big data and AI solution. And this also relates to the methodology as well. So currently, we are looking to identify up to 3 appropriate models for the financial sector. So there are currently existing data which can be used as a proxy for the purpose of exposure quantification, for example. So like what I've said earlier in terms of the flood risk, we do see that there are actually open source digital elevation model, terrain and surface models which can be used and also supplemented with machine learning techniques such as the k-nearest neighbor and random forest to predict flood risk. So we came across a research in China where there are some researchers who have already developed flood inundation prediction model by just using 3 variables. The first one is on elevation, second land use, and thirdly in terms of hourly rainfall. And they have successfully predicted flood in the Fengxi district in the Guangdong province in China. So these are just some of the examples in terms of how the existing data can be leveraged as a proxy to manage the climate risk. And by the end of the year, the subcommittee is looking to identify 3 models for the financial sector using available data to make investment and lending decisions. The last one, number 4, is in terms of addressing the remaining data gaps of the top 8 data groups. So in the longer term, we are looking to continue to advocate for better data, which means more available, reliable and comparable data from data providers, be it public or private, and to also ease the access. So for example, we are also looking to explore having a centralized platform for ESG data disclosures by companies. So that's all that I'm sharing today on our work so far. So data is often cited as one of the major hurdles in assessing climate risks. But over time, I'm confident that with the current progress that we are seeing now, like what Arina shared earlier in the previous session, in terms of convergence towards a common and consistent set of disclosure standards and taxonomy. And secondly, the development of well-defined and decision-useful metrics, certification labels, methodological standards will help to address the data challenges that we have encountered so far. And in the meantime, we hope that the industry will optimize the power or the usage of available data to assess and manage climate risks. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions and even listen to ideas on how the Subcommittee 5 can help to better address your climate data challenges.
Hi Ling Ming, thank you very much for your presentation. Again, really useful, lots of information you provided. Although we are still a little bit behind time, so I am going to suggest we move into the next presentation. However, I mean, there have been a number of questions that have come up on the Zoom Q&A throughout that session. So if you are able to answer some of those over the rest of the webinar, that would be great, and we might be able to come back and get you to answer some of them verbally to the audience a bit later. But so many thanks so far for your presentation. Again, another really good detailed presentation. Many thanks. So I think as I said, we will move straight on to the next presentation. So please do use the Q&A function to keep asking questions. And as I've said, Li Ming will look at answering some of those for her. And I know Irina has said she will go through and look at some of the ones from her presentation as well. And if we have time, we'll come back at the end and pick up some of those that we can perhaps get Li Ming and Irina to answer directly over the Zoom. But having said that, as I said, we'll move straight into the next presentation, and this is around the use case for ESG data. And I'm pleased to be able to introduce Mike Zietmeier. So, and I do apologise, Mike, I do hope I've got your surname correct, who's a partner in EY UK, a leader in our sustainable finance practice, and he particularly focuses on the use of data and technology in sustainable finance. So I'll hand over to Mike. Looking forward to your presentation.
Russell, good morning. Thank you very much for the time, and a good morning from the UK to those of you in Malaysia. Can we move on to the polling question? So can I ask the moderator to kick the poll off, please? And while we do that, I'll give you a brief introduction to who I am and the topic of this presentation. So my name is Mike Zietmeier. As Russell said, I'm based here in the UK. I lead our technology and data response to sustainable finance and financial services globally. My background is I spent 30 years working in the financial markets, primarily in front office risk and regulation compliance, and also in transaction banking. I also have, for amusement, a background in glaciology, which gives me the opportunity to be able to dig out my old photographs and use them as backgrounds, because they obviously have relevance to what we're doing at the moment. I think the key thing there is that as somebody who has continued to stay actively interested in the science around climate change, it's allowed me to bring a level of insight into some of the changes we're seeing in the environment, not just from a climate perspective, but the impacts of climate change and more broadly impact on nature. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society here in the UK, so I bring a level of that continued access and interest around the science that quantifies climate change. So can we see any of the output from the poll, please? Looks like as a technology partner, my technology is operating slow today. So really interesting and not that surprising that the focus has been around regulation and response to that, and also understanding the risks. That would be, if I were to ask that question in any other jurisdiction, that would be fairly close to what I'm expecting to see in many of the other jurisdictions that we work in. The focus is on understanding and quantifying the risk, and also understanding what the regulatory requirements are and how you respond to those. So we will touch on that, but I'm also going to touch on the importance of ESG data around the use, around the financing and the transition. Can we move to the next slide, please? Financial services there's a very conscious decision by policymakers and central banks to use financial services as a mechanism to be able to finance the transition to a more sustainable world, but also as a mechanism to actively direct flows of capital to that transition activities. The UN last year estimated that it would take $100 trillion to be able to transition the world by 2050 to be able to deliver or meet the 1.5 centigrade target outlined by Paris. And we heard last year at COP26 that the finance industry committed $140 trillion of finance to be able to support that transition. So one of the key things there is that there is no lack of appetite and ambition or access to capital to be able to support the transition. The question really is how do we do that in a way that is conscious? We understand what the impact will be from the use of that capital to be able to support that transition, and is the impact associated with that being delivered, whether it's through lending and credit provision, or through capital markets in banking, or whether through as an investor in both in an organization or investing in new technologies that will support that transition, or whether you're from an insurer or a pension provider where you're providing annuity around that. I think one of the things to flag is that, and we've heard that from Li Ming, which was a lot of the focus today is around greenhouse gas emissions relating to climate change. We're talking about ESG here, which is broader than just climate change. And I think there's a second aspect to it, which is people need to be aware of and consider what I call the double materiality, which is people are focusing on not just greenhouse gas emissions and the financing of those emissions, but also thinking about what the impact is of the products and services that a financial services provider's customer will be delivering into the market. So as an example, let's just take tobacco very briefly. Tobacco is an industry. You could have a diverse board. You could have evidence that you have no child labour within your supply chain. You are providing support, education, health to your employees within your organisation, but you are still producing tobacco, which has clearly a health impact on the people who use tobacco. So the question you need to understand is that a sustainable business? Is that a business that you want to be able to invest in? It's creating a very complex set of challenges that financial services organisations now need to consider as part of their investment or lending activities. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the question that we're seeing people starting to pose now is, what is the data that we need to be able to get access to? So some of the questions we are asking ourselves, and you can see some of the data here, is this qualitative or quantitative data? Is this data that has been assured or audited in some form, therefore the reliance which we can base on that is greater than a set of potentially statements or communications which are part about shaping the brand and communication of the organisation. And some of an understanding that data and the way that data is being published out into the public domain, and whether or not it's been attested and ensured, that is really important on the level of reliance you can place on that. Considering around the methodologies against which commitments are being made and the standard that's being used is really important as well, because there are over 400 different standards for ESG out in the market today. So having comparability between those is challenging. And if you want some interesting analysis that MIT did over a year, which is looking at some of the, particularly around the ESG scorings and credit ratings, there is a very low correlation between those, because the methodology, the underlying data that's being used to drive those are not consistent, and that provides some really significant challenges for financial services providers to rely on that set of information to inform financial decision making. Can we move to the next slide, please? So then the question becomes okay, so how do you use that data? So one of the things we're seeing in the market today is because ESG data in many cases, and you heard this from Li Ming, which was there is new sets of data there, which in many cases organizations, whether you're a corporate or a financial services provider, this is new data that you haven't had to use before, You may not have the data owners within your organization, but also how you apply that data within the decision-making, operational decision, the origination, manufacturing, the financial decisioning. Asking somebody is what data do you need to be able to bring into an assessment of the ESG implications of that decision? That's a very hard question for many people to answer. So one of the things we're seeing organizations do as part of thinking through how do we get value from our ESG data is to start asking the question around the use cases of that. And that serves two benefits. One is it helps inform people around the application of ESG as a decision criteria and the data that's needed to be able to support that. But also there's a secondary element to that, which is this is data that is going to be relied on by different roles and parties within an organization as they make those decisions. And I'll touch on that again in a later slide. So as you go through an understanding, what do you need to know around what the data is and how you're going to onboard it, you need to start thinking around those use cases and engaging different stakeholders to go through the assessment as to what data you need, where are you going to source it from, and I'll touch on some of those challenges in a minute. You need to think about how you're going to integrate that within your organization, recognizing that this data is new data, it's data that's going to evolve very rapidly over the next 3 to 4 years, whether that is new data sources come on, or you see organizations acquire different data providers and integrate that into their existing data services or scoring services. There is going to be significant change. So you need to understand how do you manage that data. Could we move to the next slide, please? So if we look at some of the data that and how you get access to that data, clearly there are existing data providers. We are tracking, I think, now in excess of over 110 different dedicated ESG data providers who are providing data services. And that is the traditional credit rating agencies, scoring agencies, data providers. There are what I would classify as fintechs that are coming to market who are using machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to bring together their qualitative and quantitative data sets to drive insights from that. So the challenge is you've got multiple different sources of data that you need to be able to bring together. I think one of the other things, and Li Ming referenced that in her slides, which was it's not just a case of going to buy data sets that you can rely on. There are open source data sets and there are proxy data sets that you can derive, which you may want to be able, depending on the scope of your portfolio, around both an organization, sector and geography, you may not be able to get access to data sets that you can go and buy, but you may need to rely on public data sets to be able to derive the insights and scorings that you need to do. So there are, for example, open source initiatives that are underway. One of those, for example, is Open Source Climate, which is creating what is called a data commons, which allows organizations to have basically a dictionary and a thesaurus, which allows you to go and access public sets of data, whether that be satellite data, hydrographic data from different public sources, but they are creating a mechanism for you to be able to source that once without having to go through the mapping to those underlying data sources. Those types of initiatives are really, really important because we recognize we have a fragmented data set, but also you're going to have to bring those data sets together to allow to be able to drive the insights. And you heard from Li Ming around the example in China around being able to take raw data to drive some of the flood risk assessment that you may need to do from your quant teams. Can we move to the next slide, please? So one of the things I've touched on here, and it reflects the questions that in the opening poll, was I focused on some of the risks of use of that data, and that is largely for risk purposes. The bottom right here, I really want to focus on the opportunity. Many organizations and many policymakers and governments are making a commitment to transition to create a more sustainable economy and organizations recognize and want to evolve their commitment to have a sustainable purpose within their organization. That's not just the organization itself, but the impact that they have within the ecosystem in which they're delivering their products and services. Being able to understand what your role is and how you deliver that, I think, is really important. And being able to understand how you're going to derive a competitive advantage on the use of that data, I think, is really important. Let's go back to the tobacco example that I referenced earlier. Philip Morris is a tobacco organization. It's one of the largest tobacco providers in the world. They made a commitment back in 2018, I think it was, that they recognized as a tobacco company the impact that their products had, however sustainable they were within their organization, had a negative impact in the broader industry. So what they have committed to do is to identify and create alternative delivery mechanisms for nicotine, because nicotine clearly is a highly addictive drug. But many of the health implications associated with smoking is in relationship to burning of tobacco. So they, as an organization, have committed by 2030 to, I think it's 2030, that they will, half of their global revenue will come from alternative mechanisms other than the burning of tobacco to reduce the health impact associated with that. So they, as an organization, have both recognized that whatever they do, they have to address the underlying issue of the impact of their products and services. And as a financial services provider, we will make an assessment as a financial service provider as to whether or not we want to invest in that, and we recognize that organization is making that transition and understanding the impact of their services. That, for me, is an example of where an organization has recognized the need, but also using that assessment to be able to drive competitive advantage. Can we move to the next slide, please? So one of the things that is really important to recognize here is that though ESG data is a new data domain, so if you're dealing with satellite data, if you're using hydrographic data, physical hazard, physical vulnerability data, much of that data, in many cases, organizations have not had to deal with before. And therefore, you have a new data domain, which will have a new set of data services associated with that. One of the things I think is important for people to recognize is that doesn't mean, therefore, that you go and treat ESG data as something that is completely different from what you have within your organization and create a parallel mechanism to be able to manage that data from the way that you use data within your organization today. Doing that would then create effectively a parallel set of data that you would need to reconcile with your finances, within your origination and in the front office, as well as within your sort of operations within your business. One of the things we are flagging to people is to think about ESG data as a set of data that you start embedding into your existing governance, control, and management of data today. There's a second aspect to that, which I see many organizations are now looking at the opportunity that you have a new data domain, which is a thematic set of data that will be needed front to back within your organization and horizontally across all support functions. A number of organizations are starting to say, does this present us an opportunity for us to be able to evolve and to move all of our data to a new way of being able to manage data, whether that is hosting that in the cloud, to have modern data management, data control processes, and data lineage on that. Organizations are looking at the opportunity to be able to use ESG data as the business case to be able to address the underlying weaknesses in the way that data is being managed in the organization today. And I can see a number of financial services organizations across banking, insurance, and wealth management who are now saying, here's the business case that we haven't had before to be able to invest in, to be able to manage our data in a different way. And I think that's a very positive thing that organizations should consider as part of managing ESG data. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, let's just explore how some of this ESG data is being used. So Li Ming did a really good example of some of the use cases around how data could be used for different purposes. I just want to explore it down into from a risk perspective, recognizing risk was number one on the list of your areas that you were interested in and you focused on. So let's just take a hypothetical example. You've got a business that wants to invest in a renewable or a sustainable energy production. Let's say that's by a biodigester. That biodigesting and energy production from a transition risk exposure, yes, it's moving away from hydrocarbons to looking at bio-based energy production. It's around energy. Clearly, there will be energy production is water intensive. It requires the building of infrastructure to be able to support that. All of those from a transitionary risk exposure, there are considerations and dimensions that you'll want to be able to make an assessment of. The question then becomes, which is, okay, so because it's energy production is very water intensive, because you need it for cooling, where is it going to be based? So often that's based next to water. Therefore, it's important to be able to understand how you're going to use that water. You need to have an assessment of not only water usage, but also what are the potential flooding risks associated because you're near water courses. Could that be from water intensity, from rainfall, or it could be associated with things like tidal surges because related to storm intensity and raised sea levels. All of those are things that you want to be able to assess from a physical risk assessment, and also depending on geographically where the investment's being made, the risk types the risk scale may be different in different geographies. All of that needs to be brought together for you to be able to make an assessment as to not only from a financed emissions perspective what you're financing in at the point in time of the transaction, but also over the life of the transaction, do any of those risks change? So one of the things it's important for people to recognize is that it's not just at the point you make a financial decision and you make an investment, but it's also being able to assure that over the life of that investment, whether it's a short tenor or a long tenor, you actually can evidence that the risk, you understand what the risk is and whether the risk has changed. And embedding that within organizations today is still something that still needs to be worked on. Can we move to the next slide, please? I'm conscious of time. So sorry, I've just lost my flow. The number of slides on here is different from the ones of the original deck. Okay, so from a inclusion perspective, it's really important to be able to link how you are using your ESG data across the three activities identified there back to your risk strategy and your risk appetite and your risk framework. What I'm seeing in the industry today is that at the top level within an organization, either driven by the regulatory policy environment or by an organization recognizing this as a existential risk to their financial decision making, they are starting to embed not only climate but broader ESG considerations into their risk appetite and risk strategy. One of the things that I think we need to just recognize is how do we cascade that through the organization? How do you embed that within your organization? So, for example, if you're a financial services organization and you've signed up to PCAF, you will have made, and for GFANS, which is Glasgow Financial Network for Net Zero, Banks for Net Zero, you've made a commitment to exit thermal coal by a certain time. Being able to understand which organizations you are investing in, or part of their operations that use thermal coal. How are you going to manage that investment? How are you going to make decisions over the period of time between now and 2035, when you may have said that you're going to exit thermal coal? If the organization wants to divest, which we have seen many organizations do that, divest from thermal coal, is that a good transition activity? Being able to move that out of their business, yes, for that organization, that'll be really good because they've reduced their carbon emissions, they've got rid of one of the most dirty forms of energy production. But is that a good thing? Is it better actually as an investor or a lender to engage with that organization as to support them to transition away from thermal coal? All of that needs to be factored into the analysis, decision making, and determination as to whether or not you invest in an organization. And that is a complex process, and the need to be able to access that data. So if you move to the next slide, there's a consideration that you need to have, which is how do you bring in those the materiality considerations around ESG. So if you look at, for example, what the ISSB is doing, ISSB is focused on just greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a single materiality. If you look at ESG, ESG is a multi-materiality decision process, which is hugely complex for the financial decision making, and the reliance on both quantitative and qualitative data to be able to inform that decision, I think is very challenging, particularly in the origination and in the risk decisioning and credit scoring. If we go back to the tobacco example, if you think about Philip Morris, how would you bring into Philip Morris as an example into this qualitative, quantitative? Key considerations that you will want to assess yourself with. Philip Morris has made a commitment. Fantastic. They are transitioning. The question is, are they transitioning against that commitment, and also are they transitioning with the momentum that they're committed to do? How do you assess that? And then finally, do you, as an organization, do you have the quantitative analysis to be able to support your ongoing investments within Philip Morris, as an example? Can we move to the next slide, please? I just want to pick up, this is an example of Manulife. So Manulife, for those of you who may not be aware, is a Canadian-based life insurer, has operations in North America and in Asia. This is another example, like Philip Morris, where in 2018, Manulife made a commitment to exit, or actually they shut down their oil sands sector fund, because they recognized at that time that against the commitments they've made here around their stewardship and their commitment to be able to have a more sustainable business, they needed to exit oil sands as a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. They have also, and I'll use the words very specifically, have made a commitment to assess their funding of nearly $500 million of hydrocarbon-based businesses to achieve net zero in 2050. So in one instance, they shut down their oil sands sector fund. In another, they're in the process of assessing. How you treat that is very different. I'm conscious of time, so could we move to let's look at, next slide, please. So if we look at the different sets of data and why it's useful, two messages I want to leave you with on this one. Yes, there is lots of different data there, and what that data will be used today will evolve over time. So we've got here, for example, net zero alignment. What we will see is that will evolve not only to be net zero, but also will be things like nature positive. So it will be expanded to the environmental impact and also the impact of economic activity related to nature. We also need to consider the role within an organization as to how they use this data will be different as well. So as a CEO or a CFO, a CRO, a CSO, how you use this data will be different, but you will be reliant on very similar sets of data. So one of the things we've seen in some of the work we're doing with a number of financial organizations is the level of commonality in the underlying more granular data that's being required for the CRO and CFO, which is fairly obvious, but also in being able to track commitments around, say, net zero. It is the same data, but how it's being used, how the different standards are being applied to it for disclosure or for risk quantification are different. Being able to manage that and understand that, I think, is critical. Can we move to the next slide, please? Depending on what industry you are in, will also impact the way you look at the same data. Well, the thing I want you to be cognizant of is that financial services, as the liquidity provider, will want to engage with each of these sectors to be able to assess this information for a financial decisioning. They will be also looking at the supply chain. One of the things we talk about is when we are financing a corporate in financial services, we are financing their supply chain. So we are very interested in understanding what that supply chain is and how that supply chain will be operating. So as an example, Volkswagen recently announced that they want all of their supply chain to be able to get a rating from EcoVadis. EcoVadis is a ESG ratings organization. It's widely used. That allows Volkswagen to be able to assess the ecosystem in which they work, both supply chain and distribution chain. Does it meet their strategic commitments around sustainability, but also they now have a mechanism to be able to quantify ESG across that supply chain. Can we move to the next slide? Actually, I'm just conscious of time. Could we just move to the next slide, and then we'll use that as the last slide. Okay, so what we have here today is a Malaysian example around how the use of proceeds to be able to support environmental outcomes and how that is disclosed. What I want to flag here is that this is a Malaysian example. What we are also seeing is many other jurisdictions, and I'm sure Arena talked about at the start, that there are multiple other taxonomies that are being developed in different jurisdictions. From a data perspective, there are common sets of data that exist across those different taxonomies or disclosure mechanisms. But the other thing is that they're often extraterritorial. So if you look at here in Europe, the European Union, EFRAG, have just announced what they call corporate services reporting disclosures. That is, if you have operations within European boundaries, you will need to disclose around CSRD because it's extraterritorial. The SEC have also announced a similar set of reporting disclosures, not only for greenhouse gas emissions, but also, not many people talk about it, around diversity and social reporting. Last year, the SEC put out a similar disclosure requirement for consultation. So thinking about how that reporting works, not just for the individual jurisdiction which you operate in, but also think about the other jurisdictions that you will be selling your products and services into, or you may have subsidiaries, is really important, because you will need to be able to access common sets of data that sit below that to be able to use that to support the different disclosure and reporting requirements, and also to be evidence the outcomes or impacts of the products and services that you're selling or manufacturing. On that basis, I will come to a halt because I'm conscious we're running over slightly. I'm happy to take any questions in the chat. I will stay on for a while, and also offline pick up from Russell. Thank you very much, Russell.
Thanks, Mike, and again, thanks for a great presentation. A lot of information there. So sure that was helpful for the audience. Yeah, thanks for saying that you'll stay online. I think there are some questions coming up in the Q&A box that you might want to answer, and so if we have some time at the end, we might come back to a number of our speakers to get them to answer some questions live if you like. And I will just repeat what I said earlier. We will be making the presentations available to all of you after after the event. So he said, please don't worry if you've missed something or want to be able to refer to these in your own time. You will be getting access to the slides after the event. But we will move on to the last session of today. We are still a bit behind time, but thankfully no more behind time than we were earlier. So and I'm hoping that we will be able to make up some of that in the next 50 minutes. And so we will aim to finish as close to 6 p.m. As we can. So now we're going to have two presentations that are around exploring the power of ESG data. We're going to hear from two speakers. Firstly, Miranda Carr, who is the head of applied ESG research for Asia Pacific at the MSCI, and Helena Fung, who's the Asia Pacific head of sustainable investment at FTSE Russell. I will get each of them to introduce themselves when they speak, rather than me reading out their impressive and detailed CVs. And without further ado, I will hand over to Miranda to give her to provide her presentation. Thank you, Miranda.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Russell. And very delighted to be here and joining the discussion. Yes, so I'm Miranda, based in Singapore. I joined MSCI in January last year. And I particularly concentrate on, as Russell was saying, this sort of applied ESG research. So sort of how a lot of the ESG ratings and metrics in climate can actually be used in practice. Prior to that, I used to work at Haitong Securities, a Chinese company that I'm sure securities company, where I helped them launch their first ESG research, and it's been a long-term interest. So I'm going to spend the first 10-15 minutes, because you have a sort of unusual combination of MSCI and FTSE Russell, who would be on competing panels to talk through the ESG data. But I'll run first through sort of why people are adopting ESG data in investment, and then a bit about sort of how we do ESG ratings, before handing over to Helena to talk through how FTSE Russell approaches the sort of ESG and climate ratings and data, and more about sort of how it's integrated at a sort of both an index and a portfolio level. And then we'll leave time for questions, plenty of time for questions at the end. So I'll just share my screen. And so we've got the first, if everyone can now see that, I hope. So in terms of the, I mean, we ESG ratings, MSCI is a good example. We used to sort of consider ESG ratings as a distinct business from the rest of our operations. It's just mainly sort of index and analytics, and also so we've got real estate business as well. But it's increasingly becoming integrated into every single investment decision. And so we are now what we would call sort of one MSCI. It might sound a bit of marketing, but it's genuinely how both investors and the market is moving. You can see a huge, obviously, talked already, sort of huge adoption by the major asset owners. And it's the adoption by the major asset owners which is arguably what's propelling a lot of the then asset managers to then adopt a lot of the ESG integration principles. Because if you've got pressure from your clients, then that feeds down to the asset managers, which then feeds down to the companies themselves. So there's a, circular sort of momentum building in terms of the adoption. Why are asset owners particularly interested in it? I mean, we have evidence of sort of long-term outperformance if you use the ESG metrics, and particularly it's not the necessarily higher returns, but it's the lower risk. As sort of talked about earlier, the risk element is a crucial factor in the ESG considerations. And over the long term, we did a study recently, and it was looking at, is it ESG as a whole, or is it actually the sort of like, is environmental or governance or S or the social pillar more important? But the interesting thing is that it was actually sort of putting it all together as an addition to the sort of the financial metrics, where ESG really came into its own. And so the governance is almost as important as the sort of the environmental and climate side when you're looking at the overall company performance. So how are people doing this? So then sort of the portfolio managers are then integrating across that they're using it to define their existing investment strategy, sort of whether that's looking for thematics related to ESG, or whether it's considering which assets they want to invest in, or the long-term sort of some of the sort of more long-term sort of economic shifts, particularly in terms of the development of new energy and how that's affecting the sort of climate transition. So that can be all part of the investment strategy. Then you've got the portfolio management side, where you're sort of incorporating the ESG metrics in a much more sort of detailed way, in terms of I want my portfolio to have this level of ESG score, or this climate alignment, or this level of carbon emissions. So you're talking about sort of the construction process. Then you need to consider a lot more of the ESG and climate data and metrics. And then the final bit is actually getting down into the nitty-gritty of the modeling side, where the actual ESG metrics and ratings are used much more in the investment research. So, your long-term DCF models or your future growth projections for the sector can be reconsidered on the sort of ESG and the climate metrics. So if you like, the sort of ESG ratings tend to be used much more sort of for your strategy and portfolio management, whereas if you're looking for the underlying ESG metrics, that's when you're getting more into the sort of company data and modeling. And how all the different institutions then use this, you've got the asset owners using the data for their overall strategies. The asset managers are then using it for all the different tools for their integrating it into sort of equities, fixed income, and sort of increasingly other asset classes. We are seeing quite a big rise in sort of the wealth managers then, and a lot of the wealth managers are much more focused on things like the climate side and impact in particular. But that's becoming a big area where there's individual investors, high net worth individuals are much more focused, and so that's not looking. Whereas the asset owners and asset managers may be looking more at the risk metrics, then some of the wealth managers are sort of more focused on the impact side. And then, of course, with EY being a particular example, then a lot of the sort of corporate and corporate finance and the sort of corporate advisory are then needing it, sort of the ESG metrics and tools to raise finance in the first place. And so assessing IPOs, assessing green bonds, sustainability bonds, but even outside those green and sustainable labels, you're still getting an increasing integration of both ESG and climate metrics into a lot of the other considerations. So how do we, in terms of actually sort of the process of integration, then we have the wheel, which is the sort of, you've got to think about your overall sort of objectives and approaches. And then what are the most appropriate benchmarks, which we'll come on to, which Helena will come on to, and how you sort of integrate ESG, which benchmarks you use, how you actually do that level of integration. Then it's on to the portfolio construction side in terms of that sort of level of integration, risk management, where you could look at things like we have a climate value at risk, where you're assessing what's your portfolio downside in terms of some of the sort of climate scenarios. Then the really interesting bit is potentially the stewardship and engagement and the reporting side of it, where you're as an investor in the company, you're actually having a dialogue with the company, talking them through all the different ESG and climate issues, and then taking all that back and then feeding back into the reporting side. So there's a whole sort of process to go through in terms of sort of the ESG integration at an investment level. But coming sort of why, what are the motivations for doing so? You have two very, very different reasons for integrating ESG and climate. Now, one, which is the ESG rating side, is very much focused on the financial materiality side of and this is one of the big debates which is happening at the moment in the sort of ESG and climate sector, both for the ratings providers like ourselves, but also sort of the broader investment community. Because previously you could say, well, I'm just interested in financial materiality, how much this ESG or climate issue is going to affect the value of my portfolio and my long-term returns. But that's obviously missing out on things like what the climate impact is going to be in terms of whether it's an oil company or fossil fuel, or whether it's a McDonald's. So purely focusing on the financial return is good to, particularly in the US, when you're focusing on your fiduciary duty. And so you've got you can justify every single decision you make on sort of ESG and climate in terms of this will affect my return. But the trouble is, if then people are then demanding, okay, I want to know what the climate impact of that, or I don't want to be involved in some activities on religious grounds or on values-based grounds, or on, increasingly you have sort of the human rights grounds, then that's taking you into double materiality, where you're considering not just the impact on the company, but also the impact on the outside world. And this is currently being debated in terms of the international sustainability accounting standards, but also in terms of the overall development and of the sort of ratings and climate issues. So this debate is ongoing, and we have different metrics to factor in both. Because if you want to sort of do just the ESG sort of quality versus carbon footprint versus business activities, it's very, very, very different decisions makings. So I'll skip over in the interests of time, in terms of sort of what the different metrics we are to then assess, and how they can go from the financial materiality to the double materiality side. So the ESG integration, you have ESG ratings, and by extension, the ESG fund ratings. And that's all the sort of, the standard metrics on the environmental scores, social, corporate governance, and also increasingly on the carbon side. The climate solutions is where you start getting into the double materiality, and that's where you're thinking about the, not just how carbon price increases or physical climate risk could affect the value of your portfolio, but how the company is going to impact the environment over the long term. So this is when you start getting into sort of the impact metrics. Then there's the business involvement and screening. So things like global sanctions, particularly obviously around Russia, potentially at the moment. You might want to exclude Russia from your portfolio, or you might want to exclude certain activities, or companies that are involved in major controversies. And then the final one is where you actually say, no, I want to have some companies which actually do some good in terms of advancing environmental, like clean technology companies, or if it's on the social side, access to healthcare and finance. And then it's aligned with the SDGs, which is very popular, particularly in sort of the APAC region. So in terms of sort of what we then look at, which I'll only cover sort of briefly, we're looking at the, so why do people look at the ESG ratings to start with? So governance is a massive issue, and this is where ESG really started out. I mean, although most of the focus now is on climate, actually the long-term focus of ESG has been in the governance side. And that gives you a sign of sort of the risk and the robustness of the company overall. But then you're looking at sort of the other risk exposures, which you wouldn't conventionally look at in financial analysis necessarily. But even if you did, things like water scarcity have always been an issue for certain sectors. But even if you start looking at those sectors, what ESG metrics enable you to do is to provide some comparability, able to compare sectors against peer groups, and provide some consistency and historic data for what have previously been very sort of things that have mainly been only included in certain instances. You've actually got some sort of real trends that you can actually identify in the data, and also company performance. So that's really the issue in terms of why you want this to be systematically included in the portfolio rather than just considered on a sort of ad hoc basis. And so the different issues, we look at a whole different range, and FTSE Russell has another different range, but there is quite a lot of crossover. People accuse the ratings agencies of being sort of too disparate and sort of having too many different ratings. But to be honest, most of we did some now, most of the things that we look at are quite similar in terms of what we consider to be material to each sector, and we don't score every company on everything. It's only on the ones that are important to that sector. So you're not sort of trying to overload either companies or investors with too much information, but just provide the most important ones. And so we go through sort of quite a bit of the the difference between the sort of risk exposure and management capacity, which shows you sort of how the company is then assessed, which forms a key part of the ESG rating. But then in the final scoring, we basically take the environmental score, the social score, and the governance score, and this is all measured against the industry. So you have the sort of peer group, analysis in order to do that sort of comparison, see how well the company is performing, and that is what gives it the AAA rating, or at the other end, the CCC rating. And gives you that sort of comparability and ability to then put it into a portfolio context, where you wouldn't necessarily be able to do that if you're taking sort of individual metrics one by one. So in terms of sort of how we arrive at the ESG ratings and how you can think about integrating that into the investment process, I'll stop there and hand over to Helena, who can talk about more about sort of how the ratings are incorporated into the investment process, and particularly at an index level. Thank you.
Thanks, Miranda, and hopefully we'll be seamlessly passing over to Helena to provide her her presentation. If you can put your camera on, Helena, that would be great as well.
Yeah, my camera is on. Can you see me?
There we go. Can see you now.
Okay,
I think
great.
my computer's probably being slow, but thank you.
Let me just check I've got the right presentation loaded up here. Sorry, I think I'll need to swap that. It was almost seamless, but just 1 second. Here we go. Right. Okay, many thanks, Russell, and to the J3C team for the invitation to participate. Really happy to do this session alongside Miranda. And Miranda's correct, it's not often that we would get to share a session together, but very happy that we were able to do that, and also to collaborate beforehand. And I hope we're not going to repeat too much of each other's material. As Miranda says, we're not entirely dissimilar in terms of our approach. But we will try and pick up on some different areas here. Let me just see if I can put this on to full screen for you. Okay. Okay, so as Miranda said, I'm going to talk about this from a benchmarks perspective. And I think what we're doing in this section a little bit is exploring further the use cases and how you can really integrate ESG data into an investment approach. And I think Miranda picked up very well on the way that investors are using data, certainly in terms of the active side of things. And I'll try and also talk through how we view this from a benchmarks perspective. Just before I do go into the benchmarks element, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I'm Helen of Bong, Head of Sustainable Investment for FTSE Russell, part of the London Stock Exchange Group for the APAC region. So my remit here is really about building our sustainable investment proposition and solutions across the business and across the region, but also about working very closely with regulators, with industry groups, with asset owners and investors and other financial markets participants to drive forward thought leadership and to really help to grow the sustainable investment and finance ecosystem in this part of the world. I have a team here. I'm usually based in Hong Kong, but I happen to be in Sydney at the moment. So we are regional and we do take a very region-specific approach. Malaysia has been really important for FTSE Russell in particular because we are the index calculation agent for Bursa Malaysia. So we've had a very strong partnership with Bursa for a long time, and we have an important ESG index or benchmark in the region, which is the FTSE for Good Bursa Malaysia Index. And I'll talk a little bit about the construction approach to that as well in my 15 minutes. Before I do dive into that, a couple of things just to sort of, I guess, set out how FTSE Russell views and approaches the topic of ESG ratings in particular. I heard, I think, Arena say earlier that there isn't one convenient way of viewing or assessing or reporting against sustainability and ESG metrics, and that's certainly true. So the way that we construct our ESG ratings process is we really look across the board at the most important, widely followed and authoritative frameworks for reporting and thinking about and assessing ESG performance. So the starting point for that would be something like GRI and SASB, and then building in issue-specific frameworks such as TCFD, which is now, of course, the most authoritative reporting framework for climate relevant disclosures, and also, for example, the water aqueduct map from the WRI as a way of assessing something like water security, for example. So really making sure that we are as objective as we can be in the approach. And the importance of that also goes back to the fact that we're very much an index provider. We're, I think, by assets, tracking our benchmarks, one of, if not the world's largest index provider with about $17 trillion of assets tracking benchmarks. That's a significant proportion of global markets. So transparency is very important, as is communication and ensuring that we have a strong communication process, and we reveal our methodology to the companies that we're rating, but also to the investors that are using the data. So robustness and transparency are at the core of the way that we, and objectivity are at the core of the way that we develop the ratings. They are very bottom up, so we have around 300 or 400 different indicators, not dissimilar to Miranda, as she said. They're not applied to every company. It's done based on an assessment of materiality and what the most important issues are for each company, largely dependent on sector and on the geographical place of operation, which is often how you assess risks, but it can vary depending on different ESG themes. We wrap up the 300 plus indicators into 14 different core themes, sub-themes within those, for example, access to medicine falls within our human rights and community theme, cyber risk within customer responsibility. And they then go up into 3 different pillars, ESG, and then one overall, what we call an exposure or risk-weighted ESG score. And if you see the 4 principles that are on the left-hand side of this slide, within that whole process is a really important element of corporate communication. So we have a team called the FTSE for Good team, who are specifically there to discuss and liaise with companies that are being rated and answer their questions and ensure they understand how they're being assessed. And companies can access a portal where they get to see all of the indicators that they're being scored against, and also how we've assessed them and how we've also come to the conclusion based on the material or the reporting that they put out in public. One other thing I would just note about FTSE as a company, we recently acquired, or in 2020, acquired Refinitiv, which is a very large integrated data provider. So we're now an extremely large operation on a global basis with a stock exchange, the London Stock Exchange, at our heart. So we have operations really across the capital markets, and what we're doing on sustainability really goes across every pillar of the business, from information services to index, to capital markets, and then to the London Clearing House. We have seen a massive inflow of assets into sustainability benchmarks. I'm sure Miranda would also attest to this from MSCI's perspective. We've quadrupled the amount of assets benchmarked to sustainability indexes in about the last 2.5, 3 years. So a real shift towards this. Still a big focus, as you can see on here, on ESG, but also now on climate as well. And one of the things I'll mention as well is the different ways that companies are being assessed. It's not just about ESG, it's also looking at unpicking different dimensions of companies' exposure to risk as it relates to different themes, in particular climate change, but also upcoming risks, and ones that are coming more under the spotlight. Biodiversity is a really good example of that. We have seen a great shift in terms of the way that asset owners are integrating sustainability, and that then brings the whole market with them effectively. So we've worked very closely with asset owners to develop bespoke index solutions based on a range of different criteria. One thing I would say we do in this region is really trying to understand what is relevant to different asset owners in different parts of the market, and then to build solutions that reflect their concerns and their criteria and sort of core, I guess, beliefs around sustainability. So really trying to bring a market specific, or even a client specific solution. We know that for the integration of sustainability, it's not a one size fits all approach, and it does really reflect, I think, the concerns, considerations of the asset owners, but hopefully also of the beneficiaries that stand to be instrumental and to benefit in years to come from the integration of sustainability factors as a way of assessing and addressing long-term risks within portfolios. And then I guess also the elements that are currently driving forward this focus on sustainability, and I would say we've seen a real confluence, particularly in the markets in Asia, in terms of focus on passive assets and transferring assets into passive investment vehicles, and also the whole ecosystem that comes around that, from index and data, but also looking at structured products and derivatives as well. As we're seeing the mainstreaming of sustainable investment, we're also seeing clients and market participants wanting to have access to the full range of products that will support that investment, including things like futures and options as well. But essentially, I mean, the four main drivers that I think we would highlight here are really market demand. So demand really from end even retail and wealth investors. Regulation, particularly in Europe, which is prompting development in terms of sustainability frameworks. Clients and investors signing up to external commitments. So, for example, making net zero or low carbon commitments, and then really having to find solutions to integrate that across, really some quite large pools of assets. And again, this is where I think investing through benchmarks and having a very robust rules-based methodology, which is then public, because you have to, as a benchmark provider, we need to really ensure that we are disclosing outcomes and also disclosing methodologies and through ground rules and reporting to index users. So applying or helping clients and users and investors to be able to live up to those commitments through the creation of tools that speak to the objectives of their sustainability approaches. So I think Mike mentioned the GFANZ initiative, which is one which obviously has a lot of assets behind it, but then requires all sections of the market to really move in terms of providing the solutions that are necessary to meet those kind of outcomes. And then internal commitments. We've seen a lot of investors signing up to internal policies in terms of the way that they want to take forward their sustainability propositions. I mentioned before that there isn't now one way of looking at sustainability, and I think we're sort of moving from a world where ESG ratings have been really the standalone sort of sole input to integrating considerations around what long-term sustainable performance and risk management should look like, to actually trying to understand, not only from a risk perspective, but also in terms of opportunity and the drivers of market value and alpha, what the key elements are in terms of the way that we assess corporates, also to some degree sovereigns as well. And then building a portfolio around different elements of this and in different ways. I'll get onto the methodology and index portfolio construction piece of this in a minute. But certainly there's a great appetite to really understand what's driving sustainability performance. And here, and I had one of the panelists talk quite extensively earlier about taxonomies. So understanding what proportion of company revenues, for example, is aligned with green and sustainable, environmentally beneficial solutions is now a huge area of focus, because this is really very much part of TCFD and of understanding how companies are responding to opportunity in the transition to a low carbon environment. I think reporting or integrating carbon emissions is now mainstream, is a core consideration, particularly in terms of the way that companies report, although we know that currently not all companies are reporting. I think globally it's around 40% of our GEES universe that currently report their scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions. So there is some way to go in that, considering company exposure to fossil fuel reserves. So if you think about companies' exposure to future carbon emissions, what does that look like, and how much do they potentially stand to lose by having these assets on their balance sheets? ESG ratings, I think, are well understood. Something like TPI carbon performance is a forward-looking view of how companies are aligned with different climate temporal pathways. So are they aligned with the 2-degree scenario below, or not aligned with that, or aligned with NDCs? And how do you then integrate that into your index or portfolio construction process? Because a lot of these data sets really are applicable both to active management, but also to benchmarking as well. And then the management quality piece is an assessment of TCFD alignment. So again, taking a forward-looking view at how companies are configuring their business strategy and governance around climate to prepare themselves for the transition to low carbon economy. At the same time, we also look at specific data sets. So thinking through if you don't have disclosed data on a consistent basis for a sector, like on the property sector, for example, how can you use newer methodologies, for example, very specific elements of modeling around emissions for buildings to be able to identify solutions for that. And then in terms of, and I think Miranda probably had a similar slide in terms of understanding what clients' motivations are in integrating ESG, and then using different approaches to be able to build that into a portfolio. So, so thinking through whether you want to have a screened approach, are you looking to expose to a best-in-class subset of companies, whether that's through a climate thematic approach, selecting companies with higher green revenues, or companies that are really making great strides in renewable energy, or in bringing electricity or NEV powered battery vehicles, for example, or whether it's assessing the best-in-class approach to ESG integration. We have other users of benchmarks who would like to be more benchmark aware. They'd like to have a performance which is closer to the underlying benchmark by simply using a tilted methodology. So rather than increasing their tracking error by having a selection-based approach, simply taking the existing constituents of a benchmark and then tilting them according to different inputs. So overweighting companies with better ESG performance or with lower carbon emissions intensity, and underweighting those with either a worse or a lower ESG score or a higher carbon intensity, so that you can either push up your ESG profile for the benchmark or underweight carbon within the benchmark. So different approaches really depending on the outcome and the conviction in many ways of the client, of the user of the benchmark. And also, and I think Miranda talked about this very well as well, but also thinking through what do users not want to have exposure to. So do we need to take out subsets of companies that are involved in specific activities or that have significant controversies? And this slide simply represents really what we think of as a building block approach. So you can take all of these data inputs and then combine them within an index environment to reach sustainability goals. So there's really a great deal of scope for configuring these in a different way. The other point I guess to make is really the messages that are being sent to companies through these benchmarks and the ability to use benchmarks, as we've seen in Malaysia with the FTSE for Good Best Malaysia Index, as a means of engagement. We've seen that also in other regions in Asia with the FTSE Blossom indexes in Japan as well, for example. So they can be a great motivator and an incentivization to companies to improve their scores, because companies know that they will get a position in the index or a greater weight in the index through an improved ESG performance. I'm going to briefly mention the construction process for the FTSE for Good Best Malaysia Index, because I know it's one that has been important in the markets and that it has a use case even beyond index. And I know that we're seeing that more broadly, and I think this was touched on by one of the earlier panelists as well, in terms of ratings and data having use beyond simply investment integration. I think Mike mentioned insurance companies and banks, and we're certainly seeing banks are now very avid and important consumers of this data, and are really broadening the scope and the use case, but also the reach with their focus on unlisted issuers and also SMEs. So FTSE for Good is a very clear and transparent methodology. We have a different rating for inclusion within FTSE for Good based on where the company is headquartered. So if it's a company in the developed market, we expect to have a higher ESG rating for inclusion and a slightly lower, although converging rating for companies that are located in emerging markets of 2.0. And unlike MSCI, we score on a numeric basis, so the scores run between 0 and 5, with 5 being the highest. Now, I think we recognize that emerging markets take a little bit longer to catch up to global standards, but we do incrementally increase these scores over time, partly because companies become better and more cognizant of ESG rating methodologies. So we need to make sure that with something like FTSE for Good, we're capturing the best of the best within the index, but also I think the emerging markets inclusion threshold is also increasing over time as we're seeing emerging market companies become more familiar with ESG ratings and also with frameworks and reporting standards. So this is an overview just of the methodology, and just very briefly, we look at the same environmental, social governance issues as we do for all companies, and include a number of relevant products exclusions. We launched a Sharia compliant version of this index last year as well in Malaysia, reflecting, I think, the importance of Sharia and of ethical screens in the market as well. And have also kept the methodology of the FTSE for Good Best Malaysia Index very live to the important advancements in climate change by including an additional climate change score, which again, you can see, we basically identify companies which operate within primary impact subsectors, so those that are highly exposed to the risk of climate change. And I think these would be the obvious sectors like integrated oil and gas companies, coal mining companies, for example, and then those with a secondary impact, which would be a broader suite of industries and subsectors. So for example, railroad operators or industrial and defense manufacturers. And again, you can see that for those really important climate intensive companies, there is a higher threshold required. And for those in the secondary impact subsectors, again, we're differentiating between companies in emerging and developed markets. Russell, I'm gonna stop there and hand back to you. I think that's probably we used up my time by now.
Thanks, Elena. That's great. And also, thanks, Miranda. We've obviously got about 10 minutes to go to wrap up, and I think we did want to sort of try and cover a few questions, but perhaps I can ask Miranda and Helena a couple of questions right now, and then if we have a bit of time, we can bring in some of the other speakers and ask them some questions as well. So, but I'm keen to make sure we do wrap up at 6 p.m. So I think, for Helena and Miranda, I had two questions. Firstly, obviously, this is a presentation to a predominantly Malaysian audience, and obviously, so focus on Malaysia, but obviously operate in ASEAN and beyond. So I'm just interested in sort of which countries and regions you see are most active in using the kind of using the ratings that you provide. Maybe Miranda, you could give your view, and then I'll come back to Helena on that.
Well, Malaysia is probably one of the most active in ASEAN. Malaysia is the most active in terms of both company interest and investor interest as well. It's really, I was just earlier, I was booked on a call with a company earlier to talk about how to improve their ESG and climate scores just earlier this afternoon. And so there's the level of interest and awareness in Malaysia. I would also say Thailand's another very good market where we did quite a big project last year, and in terms of sort of the adoption and the scoring and the awareness, then I think you are getting that this because sometimes on the scores people think, oh yeah, well, all emerging markets are going to score lower than developed markets, and they're always going to get penalized. But if you actually look at the companies, there's actually a lot of really positive examples and quite high scoring companies depending on which issue you're talking about. Things like Thailand's very good on biodiversity. Malaysia is actually quite good on corporate governance and climate. So you do have, particularly on some key issues, really good examples of really strong companies that have addressed some of the sort of big issues. They're very aware. The early conversation was about scope 3 and which of the scope 3 ones they should be addressing in order to be able to get to their climate score up. So it's not even just a sort of introductory calls anymore. It's really sort of quite detailed, and so I think there's the rising, and what I think is the regulations driving that, foreign investors are driving that, and it's really, I think possibly the missing bit is some of the domestic asset owner and investor demand, but hopefully that's coming in with a lot of the sort of new awareness and regulation. So I think it's quite a positive market to be in.
Thanks, Miranda. And Helena, what would be your answer to that question?
Yeah, I would probably concur with the fact that, ASEAN in general, I think, is really quite motivated in terms of understanding scoring and wanting to take strides. I think it's interesting because you see a different approach in different regions. I was in Singapore, where Miranda's based, last week. And there's a huge shift there and a focus on sustainability and green fintech, and looking at alternative ways of identifying and measuring and monitoring climate risk in particular. But outside of that, it's really interesting. I'm on a bit of a tour of Asia right now, having not traveled to Hong Kong for a long time. I'm currently in Sydney, and I would say almost there's a bit less focus here, as you might imagine, on the climate agenda. But Japan, I mentioned already. We find, if you look at the number of TCFD signatories in Japan, I think they really have embraced that sort of framework approach. And I know that when we run the FTSE for Good, the FTSE Blossom Index, as it's called in Japan, there's huge appetite there for engagement, for understanding how companies can sort of improve and disclose and so on. So but I think ASEAN is a really dynamic area. So really pleased to see a lot of activity there.
Great, thanks for that. So I'll ask you one more question in a moment, but as I said at the beginning of this, the whole webinar, we would be asking the audience to provide some feedback on the webinar in general, and if I can ask those questions to be put up, and whilst you are answering those questions, we'll carry on with the Q&A. And if I can ask Arena, Mike, and Li Ming to be ready to answer a question I'm going to ask them in a moment. But perhaps I can just put say another sort of follow-up question to Miranda and Helena. Obviously, you kind of, you've been listening into the presentations today. You've kind of got a sense, the audience, I think, is a varied audience in terms of, I think, some having some experience of ESG and thinking about the data, and others who aren't. I mean, what would be the one piece of advice you would give to those people on the call in relation to sort of ESG data, obviously, which is the purpose of this event? And as you're the one who's on my screen at the moment, maybe Helena, you can start with that question, and I'll go back to Miranda. So yeah, Helena, what's the one piece of advice you would give to the participants on this call?
Understand the methodology. So look beyond the top level score and really get into the weeds of what is being assessed, and know what goes into the computation of that score. Don't take it at face value. Really try and sort of understand it at a granular level. Then you'll get the most out of that, basically.
Thanks, and Miranda.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with Helena. Don't just think it, because people lump ESG all together as this like one thing, and supposedly it's sort of or sustainability, and there's so many different elements to it that you have to consider, and it really then depends on what you think is your are you most concerned about climate risks, or are you really worried about biodiversity, or do you want the governance side? And understanding, because we did a big project last year where there was a sort of perception that somehow there was this magic ESG score, and if you got your magic ESG score high enough in your portfolio, then that would all be fine. But then when and so they're going, well, can you break it down? And so we look at what's the S pillar and what's the G pillar and what's the E pillar, which is sort of one of the charts I showed on the presentation. And they're going, well, maybe if I just concentrate on sort of different, the G pillar or something, I can get it better. But there was this sort of need to understand that actually it's all the different elements that go into that, and why those different elements are going into it to make up the pillar, to make up that score, and what's driving those sort of either risk elements or in some cases it's the upside opportunities, it's the it's the clean tech revenues, or it's the sort of impact metrics. But yeah, dig beneath. I'd definitely agree with Helena on that. And sort of dig beneath ESG, and don't just see it as this like one big thing.
Thanks, Miranda. Now we've got about 3 minutes before we're due to end, so I was just going to bring in the other three speakers from today and ask them effectively the same question I just asked Miranda and Helena. So maybe Liming, if I can ask you to put, what's your view to this audience today? The one takeaway you would want to leave them with, say, having given your presentation and listened to some of the others.
Thanks. Hi, thanks, Russell.
No problem.
Yeah. So I think, definitely. I think if there's one key takeaway, I'm optimistic that based on the available data, there is definitely there is power of the available ESG data. So I think it's more in terms of capacity building. Is very important. I think definitely to have seminars and exchanges like this is something that is very useful for us to sort of put our heads together to understand what we can do using the current available data.
Thanks. Thanks, Liming. I can give the last word to Arena as she started off the presentations today. What would be the one takeaway you would give to the audience? I know obviously you presented a lot of material. There's been a lot of Q&A coming up, and you've listened to a lot of the other presentations. But what would be the one thing you would leave the audience with, Arena, from your point of view?
Thanks, Russell. I think something different from what the other audiences have shared is in Malaysia landscape, I think the demand for ESG is beyond just emissions and climate. As we have seen, the government has ratified ILO on forced labor supply chain by 2030. So I think what's critical is go back to what's fundamental in your business. The first part is really to understand and protect your license to operate from an ESG standpoint first. Then second, start thinking about where the strategic competitive advantage you would have from ESG, the use case. Now, if you have one is a protection agenda and second is a growth agenda on ESG, then you will start to see a certain focus areas that could be aligned to your corporate strategy. So I would say pay close attention to your key stakeholders, ensure that you understand where your key stakeholders are really asking. It could be your customer, it could be the rating, but having that structure to harness stakeholders' viewpoints is definitely the number one that you have so that you don't have a blind spot. With that, I would say that keep very much informed and build up the capability cut across senior leaderships and board level. Then the safeguards would come more critically by not just one department, but cut across the board and senior management. So hopefully that helps to wrap up and sum up some of the key points. Thanks, Russell.
Thanks, Arena. That's a great way to round off the session today, and you've ended just on 6 p.m, which is great. So I think I will now move to sort of close the webinar this afternoon. Obviously, a big thank you to the presenters today, who you've heard from. So I mean, Arena, Li Ming, Mike, Miranda, and Helena, and obviously the support of the JC3 and SC5 in hosting this webinar, along with CMM. And obviously, from our point of view, I understand we haven't got to all of the questions that you asked, and we will look to follow up where we can with those Q&As. And obviously, you'll feel free to reach out to any of the team of speakers, CMM, EY, etc., to follow up individually. We'll be more than happy to follow up with you individually in terms of things we've presented today or other issues related to ESG that you would like to follow up with. But say thank you all for your attention. It's been a long 3 hours, but I think there are lots of good information from a range of different perspectives. I hope you've all learned something and can take that away and apply that to your businesses. So thank you very much for your attention, and do have a very good evening and rest of the week.
Thank you everyone.